Chapter 67 of The Story of the 13 Colonies. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Denise Nordell. The Story of the 13 Colonies by H.A. GUERBER. Chapter 67. A Lady's Way of Helping. While Washington was in New York, Putnam had charge of the troops on Long Island. Here General Howe suddenly came upon him with such a large force that Putnam was beaten and forced to retreat. Washington, who saw the battle of Long Island from a distance, is reported to have wrung his hands and to have cried, with tears running down his cheeks, "My God, what brave fellows I must lose this day!" At nightfall the Americans were entrenched on Brooklyn Heights, where Howe planned to take the "nest of rebels" by siege. But thanks to a fog which rose over the bay, Washington cleverly and noiselessly drew off these troops, and when the sun rose on the second day, Howe found that the Americans were all on the other side of the East River. Knowing that Howe would pursue him, and not wishing to expose New York City to the enemy's cannon, Washington began to retreat up the Hudson. While part of the British army landed near the battery, the rest, under Howe himself, crossed the East River higher up, so as to cut off the retreat of the Americans under Putnam. To prevent this, Washington stationed troops at the landing at Kip's Bay, where East 34th Street now ends, bidding them hold the British at bay long enough to enable Putnam to retreat. But the Americans fled at the first fire, although Washington tried to stop them. In his rage and despair over their cowardice, Washington is said to have flung his hat on the ground and bitterly cried, "Are these the men with whom I am to defend America?" Still, one man could not hold an army in check, so Washington rode northward, sending word to Putnam to hurry, and begging Mrs. Murray, a lady living on a hill near by, to use her woman's wit to detain the enemy. Mrs. Murray bade her servants prepare refreshments, and when General Howe rode past her gate, she stepped out to invite him into her house. It was a very warm day, the house looked cool and inviting, and Howe accepted, thinking a few moments' delay would not do any harm. But the ladies proved so entertaining, and the food they set before the officers so welcome, that instead of staying only a few moments, they lingered there several hours. Finally a servant came in and whispered something to Mrs. Murray, who, rising from her seat, begged Howe to accompany her to see something which she thought might interest him. We are told that she then led the British general to an upper window and pointed out Putnam's army vanishing in the dim distance. The delay had enabled the Americans to escape to a point higher up, where they still held Forts Lee and Washington on either side of the river. While the Battle of Long Island was raging, Washington, needing information, sent Nathan Hale, a Yale graduate, into the British ranks. This brave youth was betrayed by a former friend, and the British, having taken him captive, condemned him to be hanged as a spy. This was no more than the young man expected, but they cruelly refused him a Bible or a minister to prepare for death. We are told that even his last letters to his mother and betrothed were torn to pieces before his eyes as they dragged him off to the gallows. But as the young patriot stood there surrounded by foes, he firmly said, "I regret only that I have but one life to lose for my country." These noble words are carved on the pedestal of his statue, which now stands in one of the principal squares of New York City. Howe and Clinton were now both in New York, where they were warmly welcomed by a few persons who were still faithful to King George. But as they had failed to secure the American army, they soon set out to pursue Washington, who slowly retreated before them. Washington did not try to do more than check their advance, because he knew their ships could sail up the Hudson, across which he had vainly tried to make a barrier by sinking some old ships. Step by step, therefore, Washington withdrew until he came to White Plains. There a battle was fought, but while the Americans were defeated, the British retreated on the next day, rather than renew the fight and lose more men. Washington had left General Nathan Greene in charge of Fort Washington, telling him to forsake it rather than run any risk of losing his troops, but Greene thought it would be safe to remain there a while longer. Unfortunately, however, a traitor gave General Howe the plans of the place, thus enabling him to surprise and capture Fort Washington, together with 3,000 men. These soldiers, like many other American prisoners, were sent on board a rotting ship in New York harbor, where, in the course of the Revolutionary War, more than 11,000 men died from bad food, bad water, and bad air. These victims of British cruelty were first buried in the mud at low tide, but their remains now rest in Washington Park, Brooklyn. A memorial monument has also been erected in their honor in Trinity Church, bearing the inscription, "To those great and good men who died while imprisoned in this city for their devotion to the cause of American independence." The honor was well deserved, for soldiers who die of disease or in captivity are just as likely to be heroes as those who fall on the battlefield. Washington, seeing his fort taken, now went to Hackensack, sending orders to General Charles Lee to cross the Hudson and join him in New Jersey. But instead of obeying promptly, Lee delayed so long that, as you will soon see, he hampered Washington greatly. The British, in the meantime, crossed the river, and Greene was obliged to leave Fort Lee in hot haste. Indeed, the enemy were so near that they found the soup pot still boiling on the fire, and merrily ate the dinner which was to have been served for the Americans. Still faithful to his plan to worry and check the British, without meeting them in open battle, Washington now slowly retreated across New Jersey. We are told that he often left a place as the enemy came in, and because he thus imitated the tactics of a Roman general, you will often hear him called the American Fabius. Cornwallis, the British general now in charge, pursued the Americans as fast as he could, in order to force them to meet him in pitched battles. But while the armies were often close enough to hear the music of each other's bands, and there were many small skirmishes, no real battle took place. In one of these small engagements, the wads used in loading the guns gave out. The chaplain of the regiment, who hated the British because they had cruelly shot his wife and baby, rushed into a church, tore up some hymn books, and, carrying the leaves to the soldiers for wads, said, "Give 'em Watts, boys, give 'em Watts." End of chapter 67. Recording by Denise Nordell, Modesto, California. Chapter 68 of The Story of the 13 Colonies. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Denise Nordell. The Story of the 13 Colonies by H.A. GUERBER. Chapter 68. Christmas Eve. While retreating before Cornwallis, Washington kept sending stern orders to Lee to hasten and join him, so that their combined forces could be used against the British. But Lee did not obey and came on very slowly. Indeed, he said freely that he did not consider Washington a good general, and often boasted that if he were only at the head of the army, the war would soon be over. Lee was in a little inn in New Jersey, writing a letter to General Gates expressing his opinion of Washington, when he was suddenly surrounded by the British and made a prisoner. Without giving him time to change his dressing gown and slippers, or to get into his uniform, the British bore him off in triumph, thinking they had taken the most clever of all the American generals. But Lee was really no loss, and his army, having fortunately gone on ahead, joined Washington sooner without a general than it would have done had Lee been there. Many of the Americans now fancied, like the British, that since Lee was a prisoner their mainstay was gone. Besides, the British began to threaten to ill-treat Lee, and as the Americans held no British generals as prisoners, they could not offer an exchange. Knowing this, a Rhode Island officer named Barton made a bold plan. He had heard that the British General Prescott was quartered on the seashore not very far from Newport. Taking a party of 40 brave seamen and soldiers, he rowed with muffled oars right through the British fleet one dark night. Then a sentinel was noiselessly killed, and the small force surrounded the house where Prescott lay asleep. A moment later the Americans burst into his bedroom, bore him off half-clothed to their boats, and, rowing away in safety, sent word to the British that Prescott should receive just the same treatment that they gave Lee. 9 months later an exchange was made, and Lee and Prescott went back to their posts. In the meantime Washington still avoided a battle and retreated to the Delaware. There, having cleverly secured every boat within 100 miles, he took his army over the river. When the British came up, not a single boat was to be had, so they camped near the stream, thinking it would soon freeze hard enough to allow them to cross on the ice and seize Philadelphia. This was a time of great trial for the Americans, and Washington was the only man who did not despair. Still, the British had set a price upon his head, and were loudly boasting that they would soon hang him. Speaking of this, Washington once told his friend Joseph Reed, "My neck does not feel as though it were made for a halter." Then he added that if things came to the worst, they would have to retreat into Virginia, or even over the Alleghanies, but that they must never give up the struggle they had begun. Congress, fearing the British would carry out their plan and seize Philadelphia, now hastily withdrew to Baltimore. But before leaving, Samuel Adams wrote, "Let America exert her own strength, and he who cannot be indifferent to her righteous cause will even work miracles, if necessary, to establish her feet upon a rock." Washington, as we have seen, was very prudent, but he was not lacking in courage. Seeing that the British forces were scattered, he now thought it a fine chance to win a victory, which would rekindle the ardor of his men and give new courage to all the nation. He therefore planned to surprise the Hessians at Trenton by crossing the river, in spite of huge cakes of floating ice which nearly blocked it. Marblehead fishermen were put in charge of the boats, and such was their skill and daring that they took 2,400 men safely over. This crossing of the Delaware on Christmas night, 1776, was one of the most daring feats ever performed. Besides, the men were only half clad and so badly shod that they left bloody footprints in the snow, and the cold was so intense that night that 2 of their number were actually frozen to death. In spite of drifting snow and driving wind, Washington's force marched bravely on, and surprised the Hessians at Trenton. The wounded commander, Rall, was forced to surrender, and his whole army was seized. We are told that the Hessian soldiers had been so busy keeping Christmas that they were all half drunk, and that Rall himself was too absorbed in a game of cards to read a note sent to warn him of his peril. Thinking it a matter of no importance, he thrust it into his pocket unread, and thus he and his men fell into Washington's hands. The news of the victory at Trenton filled the hearts of the Americans with great joy, but it proved a bitter disappointment to Cornwallis. Fancying the war all over, he had packed his trunks and gone on board a vessel to return to England. But now General Howe sent him back in haste to Trenton to fight Washington. Hedged in between a river full of floating ice and a large army, it now seemed as if Washington could not escape. One evening, therefore, Cornwallis gleefully told one of his officers that they would "bag the old fox" the next day. The officer suggested that it might be better not to postpone it until tomorrow, but Cornwallis answered that this time the Americans could not escape. That same night, however, Washington took advantage of the fact that the roads froze hard enough to enable him to remove his cannon, and slipped away by back roads, leaving his campfires burning brightly so as to deceive the enemy. When the British awoke the next morning, the "old fox" was gone, and sounds of firing in the direction of Princeton soon convinced them that a battle must be going on there. Running into Cornwallis's tent, an officer roused him, crying, "To arms, General! Washington has outgeneraled us. Let us fly to the rescue of Princeton." But, notwithstanding all their haste, they reached Princeton only after the battle, on the present college grounds, was all over, and the victorious Washington had safely advanced to Morristown Heights. This campaign in the dead of winter was so wonderful that it won for Washington the title of "Savior of his Country," and Frederick the Great of Prussia once said that it was the most brilliant piece of generalship in the pages of history. End of chapter 68. Recording by Denise Nordell, Modesto, California.
Chapter 69 of The Story of the 13 Colonies. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Giordano. The Story of the 13 Colonies by H.A. GUERBER. The Fight at Bennington. While Washington was spending the rest of the winter at Morristown, the news of his triumphs reached France. Franklin had been sent there in 1776 to secure help, if possible. His reputation as a man of science, his great talents, and his affable manners made him a great favorite in Paris, where the fashionable ladies and gentlemen carried fans and snuff-boxes decorated with his portrait. But although both king and queen received Franklin very graciously, they would not at first promise him any aid. A young French nobleman named Lafayette, longing to help the Americans, now decided to leave his young wife and home. But as the king forbade him to leave court, he secretly embarked upon a vessel he fitted out himself, and crossed the Atlantic. Then, as soon as he landed, he went straight to Congress and offered to help the United States without pay. A few days later he met Washington, whose helper he became, and who soon learned to love him as dearly as if he had been his own son. Several other illustrious foreigners came in the same way to fight for America and freedom. The bravest among them were the Germans De Kalb and Steuben, and the Poles Pulaski and Kosciuszko. It is said that when Kosciuszko first presented himself, and was asked what he could do, he briefly answered, "Try me." This reply so pleased Washington that he made the young man his aide-de-camp. Washington's victories at Trenton and Princeton, and his return toward New York, could not divert Howe from his purpose to secure Philadelphia. When summer came on, therefore, he set out with his fleet to take that city. Washington began retracing his steps, and, knowing that Howe could not sail up the Delaware, which was defended by forts, went to meet him at Chad's Ford on the Brandywine. Here a battle was fought, and not only were the Americans defeated, but Lafayette was sorely wounded. Although beaten, Washington's army retreated in good order to Philadelphia, which was soon taken by Howe and the British forces. Hoping to drive them away, Washington surprised them one morning at Germantown. Here he would have won a brilliant victory, had not a dense fog made two divisions of his men shoot each other before they discovered their mistake, thus creating a panic. As there was nothing to be gained by fighting with exhausted troops, Washington now withdrew, and before long went to Valley Forge for the winter. Meanwhile, Howe attacked the forts on either side of the Delaware River. One of these held out bravely for 6 days, refusing to surrender until it had been battered to pieces. Then, as one fort alone could not check the British fleet, the second surrendered also. Hoping to damage some of the British vessels at Philadelphia, the patriots made rude torpedoes, which were placed inside of small kegs and sent floating down the river. One of these engines struck a cake of ice and exploded, and the British, thus warned of danger, shot at every floating object they saw, thus waging what has been called in fun the Battle of the Kegs. The British, having nothing else to do, now settled down comfortably in Philadelphia, where they lived on the very best of everything. They spent most of their time giving balls and parties, and grew so fat and lazy that, as Franklin wittily said, Howe has not taken Philadelphia so much as Philadelphia has taken Howe. This remark proved true, for although the plan had been that Howe should march northward, he was delayed by Washington until it was almost too late. Besides, we are told that the British general never received positive orders to go north, for the paper, being badly written, was laid aside to be copied and forgotten until too late. Meanwhile, the British again tried to carry out their plan of invading New York from Canada. This time, while one army started from Lake Ontario for the Mohawk Valley, Burgoyne came southward up Lake Champlain with British and Indian troops, and took Forts Ticonderoga and Edward. This was considered a great victory in England, and when King George heard that Ticonderoga was taken, he clapped his hands and shouted, "I have beat them! I have beat all the Americans!" This was not true, however, but General Schuyler, sent to oppose Burgoyne, had so small a force that all he could do was to hinder the enemy's advance by cutting down trees and destroying bridges. The king's advisers had told Burgoyne to hire Indians to help him, and in spite of all he could do to prevent it, these savage allies fought with their usual cruelty. They even killed and scalped Jane McCrae, a beautiful young lady, who, it is said, was on her way to meet a British officer to whom she was engaged. When this man saw her long golden locks among the scalps the Indians brought back, he left the army, and spent the rest of his life alone, mourning for his betrothed. After taking the two forts, Burgoyne, hearing that there were cannon and stores at Bennington, Vermont, sent part of his German troops thither to secure them. But when his men drew near this place, they found it ably defended by General Stark. Even as a boy, this American patriot had always shown great courage and presence of mind. Once, when a prisoner of the Indians, and forced to run the gauntlet, Stark snatched a club from one of his captors, and struck right and left with such vigor that he dealt more blows than he received. Later on, He also did many brave deeds during the French and Indian wars. When the Germans drew near Bennington, Stark led his men against the foe, crying, "There they are, boys! We beat them to-day, or Molly Stark's a widow." The men, fired by his example, fought so bravely that they soon won a signal victory. As Washington said, this was a grand stroke, for the Germans were almost all captured or killed, while only a few of the Americans were lost. We are told that one old man had 5 sons in this battle. On the morrow, a neighbor, wishing to break the news of one son's death, gently said, "One of your sons has been unfortunate." "Did he run away, or neglect his duty?" the father quickly asked. "No, worse than that. He has fallen, but while fighting bravely." "Ah," said the father, "then I am satisfied." For the old man was such a good patriot that he was quite willing his sons should die for their country, and considered that only traitors and cowards needed pity. End of chapter 69. Recording by Giordano, Newport Richey, Florida. Chapter 70 of The Story of the 13 Colonies. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Giordano. The Story of the 13 Colonies by H.A. GUERBER. Burgoyne's Surrender. The victory at Bennington not only saved the American cannon and supplies from the hands of the foe, but enabled Stark and the Green Mountain Boys to get between Burgoyne and Canada. They thus cut him off from all help from the north, whence he expected both food and ammunition for his men. While Burgoyne was thus between Generals Schuyler and Stark, St. Leger, another British general, was coming along the Mohawk Valley to join Burgoyne at Albany. On his way, however, he stopped to besiege Fort Stanwix, or Schuyler. 800 volunteers set out to reinforce the garrison, but on the way thither, at Oriskany, they were surprised by the Indian chief Brant. Their leader, General Herkimer, mortally wounded in the very beginning of the engagement, bade his men place him under a tree, and then bravely said, "Now, go and fight. I will face the enemy." In spite of pain, he calmly lighted his pipe, and while smoking, directed his troops with such vigor that before long the Indians were routed. The garrison at Fort Stanwix, hearing shots in the forest, made a brave sortie, in which they captured 5 flags from St. Leger. These they hoisted above their fort, upside down, putting above them all a new flag made from pieces of a soldier's old shirt, a blue jacket, and a red flannel petticoat. Although fashioned from such queer materials, this flag bore 13 alternate red and white stripes, and in a blue field in one corner was a wreath of 13 white stars, the number of the United States. This was the new American flag suggested by Washington, whose coat of arms bore stars and stripes, and adopted by Congress in June, 1777. But while the patriots thus fashioned a rude flag in the wilderness, and were the first to fight under this emblem, it was Mrs. Ross of Philadelphia who made the first American flag of this kind in June, 1777. When Schuyler heard of Herkimer's brave stand, and of the bold sortie from Fort Stanwix, he bade Arnold go and relieve the fort. Fearing that his force might not prove strong enough, Arnold made use of a trick. He told one of the prisoners, a half-witted lad, that he should be free if he would only do exactly as he was bidden. The lad agreed, and clad in torn garments, ran to St. Leger's camp, loudly shouting, "The Americans are coming!" Of course the British and Indians crowded around him, and when the idiot was asked how many men were on the way, he answered by pointing mysteriously to the leaves on the trees overhead. This strange behavior made St. Leger believe that a large force was advancing, and created such a panic among his men that, in spite of all he could do, they beat a hasty retreat. As St. Leger had gone back, and Howe had not come up the Hudson, Burgoyne was left entirely alone in the heart of the enemy's country. Schuyler was therefore on the point of winning a glorious victory after all his hard work, when Congress suddenly bade him give up his command to General Gates. Although wounded to the quick by this order, Schuyler was too noble a man to show any anger. He gallantly said, "The country before everything," and asked permission of Gates to serve as an officer under him, since he could no longer command. Burgoyne was surrounded, and seeing that he must fight, he advanced toward the American position on Bemis Heights, near which the first battle of Saratoga took place. But night came on before it was over, and for more than 2 weeks the army stood face to face, watching each other closely, yet not daring to risk a new battle. Finally, seeing that he must fight, starve, or retreat, Burgoyne marched out again to face the Americans in what is known as the Battle of Stillwater. Daniel Morgan and his sharpshooters, posted behind trees, carefully singled out the bravest men and shot them with unerring aim. Indeed, such was their skill that it is said Morgan's riflemen could toss up an apple and shoot all the seeds out of it as it fell. Chief among the British officers on that day was General Fraser, who, when urged to take a less exposed position, simply replied, "My duty forbids me to fly from danger." Even while he was speaking thus, Morgan pointed him out to one of his best marksmen, saying, "That gallant officer is General Fraser. I admire and honor him, but he must die. Stand among those bushes and do your duty." These orders were so promptly carried out that a moment later Fraser lay among the dead. Arnold had been unjustly deprived of his command, but he could not keep out of the fray. Dashing to the front, he led the advance with his usual bravery, and forced his way into the British camp. But as he reached it he fell wounded in the same leg which had suffered at Quebec. His men tenderly bore him off the field of battle, where he had won a victory while General Gates was lingering in his tent. During the battle, some women and children who were with the British army crouched in terror in the cellar of a neighboring house, listening to the shriek of the cannon balls overhead. The wounded in this building clamored for water, until, knowing the men would perish if they ventured out, a soldier's wife marched boldly down to the river. She did this several times, in full view of the Americans, who admired her courage and let her alone. The battle had raged so fiercely that Burgoyne retreated to Saratoga, where he held a council of war to determine whether he should surrender. In the midst of his talk, an 18-pound cannon ball passed right over the table where he and his officers sat, so they quickly and wisely concluded that it was high time to give up. 1777. The British soldiers, therefore, laid down their arms, and the Americans marched into their camp playing Yankee Doodle, the tune they had adopted as a national air. We are told that Burgoyne, on handing Gates his sword in token of surrender, proudly remarked, "The fortune of war, General Gates, has made me your prisoner." To which Gates answered, as he gave it back, "I shall always be ready to bear testimony that it has not been through any fault of your Excellency." Later on, touched by the courtesy of Schuyler, whose house he had burned down, Burgoyne said, "You show me much kindness, though I have done you much injury." "That was the fate of war," said Schuyler kindly. "Let us say no more about it." End of Chapter 70. Recording by Giordano. Newport Richey, Florida.
Chapter 71 of The Story of the 13 Colonies. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Maggie Travers. The Story of the 13 Colonies by H. A. GUERBER. Winter at Valley Forge. Although Gates received all the credit at first, the two battles of Saratoga were really won by Schuyler, Morgan, and Arnold. Burgoyne's surrender proved the turning point of the Revolutionary War, so the fight at Saratoga is known as one of the decisive battles of the world. Not only did it end the British plan of separating New England from the Southern states, but it made the French promise to help the Americans openly. It also gave King George such a fright that he even offered to let the Americans send members to Parliament if they would lay down their arms and promise to obey him. But this offer, which would have more than satisfied the colonists a short time before, came too late. They had suffered so much that they were not willing to give up what they had won and again become subject to a king who, like those who had come before him, might at any time change his mind or break his promises. Besides, they remembered only too clearly that, after granting charters, kings had often taken them away again, and so they decided to keep on fighting until the matter was settled once for all. The news of the victory at Saratoga created a great sensation in Paris, where the French had been waiting to see how things turned out before they openly sided with the Americans. The king now not only acknowledged the independence of the United Colonies of America in 1778, but made a treaty of friendship and commerce with them, and soon sent a fleet to help them fight the British. This happy turn of affairs was mainly brought about by Franklin, who for the past 2 years had been making as many friends for America as he could. Everyone admired him for his learning and good nature, and the French minister Turgot once proposed his health, saying, "He snatched a thunderbolt from heaven, and the scepter from the hand of the tyrant." But Franklin, who had a keen sense of humor, and, like all really great men, was very modest, smiled and quaintly answered that while he appreciated the kindness of the speech, he was obliged to confess that not only had he left thunder in the clouds, just where he had found it, but that more than 1,000,000 of his countrymen had helped him snatch the scepter from the hands of the tyrant. News traveled so slowly in those days that it took months before Franklin heard of Burgoyne's surrender, and before Washington and Howe received word that the French were going to help the colonies openly. These months were full of hardships for all the Americans, for while the men were away fighting, the heroic women were obliged to do their work too. Washington's army, as we have seen, had encamped at Valley Forge, where the soldiers lived in rude log huts. They were without proper food or clothes, and cowered miserably over the campfires, for which they had to carry wood on their backs from neighboring forests. Even General Washington had but one room, and lived on cabbage and potatoes, with a few hickory nuts for dessert from time to time. His heart was wrung at the sight of his men's sufferings, and as soon as his wife joined him at Valley Forge, he begged her to work as hard as she could to supply the men with stockings. Mrs. Washington's own knitting needles now flew faster than ever. Besides, she interested all her friends in the work, and every day visited the soldiers' quarters, carrying them the stout garments thus secured. But provisions grew so scarce that Washington had to send all the women home, and Mrs. Washington again withdrew to Mount Vernon, where she lived as economically as possible, working day and night for her husband and the army. As if matters were not bad enough already, some of the officers now formed a plot to take the command away from Washington and put Gates at the head of the army in his stead. This plot, known as the Conway Cabal, was headed by a man named Conway, to whom Washington had been particularly kind, but who was angry because he had not been promoted as fast as he wished. The question was brought before Congress at Baltimore, where, hearing that there was danger of Washington's being dismissed for lack of vote, Duer, one of his friends, although ill in bed, determined to go to the meeting. His doctor, however, said that if he did so it would be at the risk of his life. "Do you mean I should expire before reaching the place?" asked Duer. "No, but I should not answer for your leaving it alive," answered the doctor. Hearing this, the good man firmly said, "Very well, sir, you have done your duty. Now I will do mine." Then he called for a litter to carry him to Congress. Luckily for him, some of Washington's friends came back in time to prevent his leaving his sick room. But better still for the welfare of our country, the Conway plot failed, and Washington remained at the head of the army. Conway had been so ungrateful that he was forced to leave the country, where people despised him for the mean part he had played. All these trials wrung Washington's noble heart, and as he had no privacy in his headquarters, he sometimes rode out alone to think. A Quaker, hearing a noise in the bushes, once stole up cautiously and found the general's horse tied to a tree. A few feet farther away he beheld Washington kneeling in the snow, praying aloud for his country, with great tears streaming down his cheeks. The good Quaker crept away again unseen, but in telling the story some years later, he remarked that he had felt at that time that the Lord could not but answer the fervent prayer of so good a man. End of chapter 71. Recording by Maggie Travers.
Chapter 72 of the Story of the 13 Colonies. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Bruce Kachuk. The Story of the 13 Colonies by H.A. GUERBER. The Quaker Woman. The British, quartered in Philadelphia, were leading an easy and merry life. But several times during the winter, Howe made plans to surprise Washington's troops. To his dismay, however, his plans always seemed known to the Americans, and therefore failed. Afraid that some spy might overhear him, Howe once held a secret meeting at night in the house of a Quaker woman named Lydia Darrah. To make sure that he should not be overheard, he bade her go to bed and see that all her family retired likewise. Lydia obeyed, and the general, thinking all was safe, explained his plan to his officers. But the Quaker woman had noiselessly slipped out of her room again, and was now standing at the door listening to all that was said. As soon as the talk was over, she crept back to her room, and when the officers had all gone, Howe called her, as agreed, to lock the door behind him. But she pretended to be sound asleep, and let him knock at her door 3 times before she rose, yawning, to show him out. The next day, Lydia, who had not dared breathe a word of what she had heard to anyone, said she was out of flour, and got a pass to go and buy some at a village nearby. Meeting a patriot there, she quickly warned him of Washington's peril, and then quietly went home. The next day, Howe crossly said to her, "It is very strange. You, I know, were asleep, for I knocked at your door 3 times before you heard me. Yet it is certain we were betrayed. On arriving, we found Washington so prepared at every point that we have been compelled to march back without injuring our enemy, like a parcel of fools." Lydia heard this without making a sign, and not till the war was over did it become known that it was she who had saved the army. Besides the American patriots, foreigners were helping Washington with all their might. Among these was the Prussian officer, Baron Steuben, who knew no English, and therefore brought over an interpreter with him. According to one story, this interpreter made an idle bet to kiss the first Yankee girl he met. Landing at Portsmouth, this man won his wager by stepping up to a pretty girl, bowing politely, and begging permission to kiss her, saying, "Before leaving my native land to fight for American freedom, I made a vow to ask, in earnest of victory, a kiss from the first lady I should meet." The story adds that the young lady accepted the kiss, saying she could not refuse so small a favor to a man who had come to fight, and if necessary, to die for her country. Steuben joined Washington at Valley Forge, and there began to drill the troops, so they could meet the British on an equal footing. At first, the German officer was shocked by their lack of discipline, and swore at them in every language he knew. Sometimes he even called to his interpreter, "Come and swear for me in English. These fellows will not do what I bid them." You see, soldiers in those days thought it manly to swear, and as Baron Steuben had been accustomed to European soldiers who obeyed without a question, it took him some time to grow used to Americans, who, as he said, had to be told, "This is the reason why you ought to do that," before they would obey. Still, He soon taught our men to fight like old and trained soldiers. The winter the troops spent at Valley Forge was one of the coldest ever seen, and therefore the soldiers' sufferings were very great. But with the spring, hope revived, for the news of the coming French fleet made the British leave Philadelphia to defend New York. General Howe having gone back to England for his health, it was Clinton who conducted this retreat. Leaving the camp at Valley Forge, Washington pursued him across New Jersey, planning to engage him in a battle at Monmouth, 1778. Here Lee, who had been exchanged for Prescott and was again in command, disobeyed orders and bade his men retreat. Warned by Lafayette, Washington came up just in time to check this movement, and, dashing up to Lee, hotly asked what his disobedience meant. Lee answered, "These men cannot face the British grenadiers." But Washington exclaimed, "They can do it, and they shall." He was right. The men could, and did, face the enemy bravely. But precious time had been lost, and instead of winning a victory, the Americans only managed to stand their ground. During the battle, Molly Pitcher, a gunner's wife, carrying a pail of water to her husband, saw him fall. She immediately rushed forward, took his place, and, loading his cannon, fired it as quickly and well as he. In reward for filling her husband's place that day, Congress paid her a small pension, and the soldiers, who admired her pluck, ever after called her Major Molly. When darkness came on, the fight ceased, and Washington flung himself down to rest. During the night an officer drew softly near, and the general quickly bade him advance and deliver his message, saying, "I lie here to think, and not to sleep." Washington's thoughts were busy, for now he could no longer doubt that Charles Lee was a traitor. Indeed, he foresaw what soon happened, that Lee would be dismissed from the army in disgrace. In fact, Lee, who had tried to harm the American cause, was never allowed to serve his country again, and had to withdraw to Virginia. There he lived a loveless and solitary life, in a house whose only partitions were chalk lines across the floor. End of chapter 72. Chapter 73 of the Story of the 13 Colonies. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Bruce Kachuk. The Story of the 13 Colonies by H.A. Gerber. Putnam's Adventures. On the morrow of the Battle of Monmouth, Washington found that Clinton had withdrawn his army so as to avoid a second battle. The British were now well on their way to New York, so Washington could no longer hope to overtake them. To hem them in, however, he stretched a line of American troops all the way from Morristown to West Point. But Washington had to abandon his plan for seizing New York with the help of the French fleet because the vessels drew too much water to be able to cross the bar. As the fleet could not reach New York, it made an attempt to seize Newport. Here it was met by British ships, but before a battle could take place, a sudden storm scattered both fleets and caused so much damage that they had to refit. When Clinton saw that Washington had drawn a close line about him in New Jersey, he tried to force the American general to break it by attacking the towns in Connecticut. But Washington would not stir, for he knew that General Israel Putnam, in charge of the forces there, was well able to look out for himself. As this Putnam is one of the heroes of the Revolutionary War, it will interest you to hear a few stories about him, which all Americans should know. We are told that, even as a lad, Putnam was famous for his courage. Once, when a wolf caused great damage in his neighbor's herds, he determined to kill it. But the wolf withdrew into its den, where it could be reached only by crawling along through a narrow passage. As the creature could neither be smoked nor starved out, Putnam offered to go in and kill it. Tying a rope to his foot, he bade his companions pull him out when they felt the rope twitch or heard a shot. Then he crawled along the passage on his stomach, carefully holding his gun. At the end of a few minutes he came to a place where the passage widened a little, and there, in the darkness, he saw the yellow gleam of the big wolf's eyes. Putnam raised his gun, shot, and was dragged out by his companions in such haste that his clothes were actually torn off his back, and his skin somewhat scraped. Determined to know whether the old wolf was dead, Putnam, at the end of a few minutes, again crept into the den. When his companions obeyed the twitch of the rope a few minutes later and drew him out a second time, they thought he was very heavy. But when he got out, they found he was dragging by the leg the biggest gray wolf they had ever seen. Putnam had taken part in the last French and Indian War. The year after the French took and destroyed Fort William Henry, he was with a British army that encamped on the same ground. And when this army advanced to attack Ticonderoga, his company led the way. While they were thus marching through the woods, the French surprised them, and had it not been that Rogers came to their rescue with more men, Putnam and his detachment would have fallen. At another time, we are told, Fort Edward took fire, and the powder magazine was in great danger. But Putnam fought the flames inch by inch, putting them out barely in time to prevent the explosion of the whole store of ammunition. During this French and Indian War, Putnam once volunteered to mount guard at a place where the sentinel was always found dead in the morning. While watching there, he heard a strange noise in the bushes, and saw what he took in the darkness for a wild pig or a bear. He fired at it without a moment's delay, and on drawing near, found he had killed an Indian, who, covered by a bearskin, and imitating the actions of an animal, had always managed to get near enough to the sentinels to kill them. Another time, when Putnam and Rogers were sent to recapture some baggage wagons, the latter spent the noon hour in target practice, although warned it was dangerous. The Indians, guided by the sound of firing, fell upon the British unawares, and seizing Putnam, bound him to a tree. For a while, Putnam found himself between the fire of his own party and that of the Indians, and when the latter were driven from the battlefield, they took him away with them. After torturing him in many ways, breaking his jaw, and cutting open his cheek, the Indians tied him to a tree and began to roast him alive. The fire was raging around him when a sudden and violent shower put it out, but as soon as the rain was over, the savages rekindled it. They would have succeeded in roasting Putnam alive, had not a French officer come up just then, rushed into the fire, cut him loose, and thus saved him from a horrible death. Burned, gashed, disfigured, and bowed down by weakness, Putnam was taken to Montreal, where the other prisoners were careful not to tell who he was. So the French, thinking him a poor old man who would never have the strength to fight again, gladly exchanged him for one of their captive soldiers. Putnam then went on fighting again till the war was over. He took an active part in the capture of Montreal in 1760, and in that of Havana 2 years later. A British general once showed him a French vessel on Lake Ontario, saying it must be destroyed. Putnam immediately volunteered to destroy it, and, rowing out in the dark, he secretly drove wedges behind the rudder. As the vessel could no longer obey its helm, it was soon driven ashore and wrecked. End of chapter 73. Chapter 74 of the Story of the 13 Colonies. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Bruce Kachuk. The Story of the 13 Colonies by H.A. Gerber. Indian Cruelty. The French and Indian War ended. Putnam resumed work on his Connecticut farm. At the time of the Stamp Act trouble, he and some of his fellow citizens visited the house of one of the men who had stamped paper for sale. They told him he must not sell a single sheet of it, and when he objected that he must mind the king, Putnam declared that if he dared disobey them, his house would be level with the dust in 5 minutes. You have already seen how quick Putnam was to respond to the call when the patriots flew to arms. Ever since the beginning of the war, he had been equally active. Called upon to meet the British in Connecticut with but very few men, Putnam, nevertheless, managed to hamper their movements greatly. On one occasion he found himself almost surrounded by the British. Calling to his companions to save themselves, he drew off the British soldiers, who hotly pursued him. With the enemy on 3 sides of him, and a frightfully steep and rocky slope on the other, it seemed quite impossible that Putnam should escape. But he boldly drove his spurs into his steed, rode safely down the stone steps at Horseneck, and as none of the British dared follow him, he thus managed to get away. Hearing that the British were burning farmhouses and villages in Connecticut, Washington fancied it might be a good plan to strike a blow which would frighten them and make them come back. He therefore planned to storm Stony Point, a place on the Hudson where the British were building a new fort. Sending for Anthony Wayne, an officer who was so brave and daring that his men generally called him Mad Anthony, Washington told him what he wanted. The young man, devoted to Washington, promptly cried, "I'll storm hell, General, if you will only plan it." The patriotic young soldier's answer was so well meant that Washington, who never swore himself, and generally reproved his men when they did so, merely smiled on this occasion and quietly said, "Hadn't we better try Stony Point first?" The Americans, with guns unloaded and bayonets fixed, drew near the fort unseen, led by an old negro who often went in and out of the British camp to sell strawberries. He walked up to the sentinel and whispered, "The fort is ours." As this was the password, the soldier began to chat with him, and thus did not notice the Americans creeping up behind him until they seized and gagged him. The patriots thus got halfway up the hill before the alarm was given and firing began. Although one of the first shots wounded Mad Anthony, he bade his men carry him, and, cheering his soldiers on, led the way into the fort. Taken by surprise, the British lost many men and their new fort, and at 2 o'clock in the morning Wayne wrote to Washington, "The fort and garrison, with Colonel Johnson, are ours. Our officers and men behaved like men who are determined to be free." This charge at Stony Point, 1779, is considered one of the most brilliant deeds of the Revolutionary War, and the place where it occurred is often visited. When war first broke out, the British hired many Indians to fight for them. While the 2 main armies were busy in New Jersey, southern New York, and Connecticut, people living in northern New York and all along the western frontier were in constant danger. Led by a man named Butler, some Tories, friends of the king, and many Indians suddenly appeared in the Wyoming Valley in Pennsylvania. Here they cruelly murdered men, women, and children. We are even told that a cruel soldier once ran his bayonet through a tiny baby and tossed it out of its cradle, saying it was a rebel also. Not satisfied with one raid of this kind, the Indians soon made a second one at Cherry Valley in New York. These massacres roused the Americans' anger, not only against the Indians, but also against the British for hiring the help of such cruel allies. Still, it was only the king and some of his ministers who were to blame for this, for most Englishmen felt like Burke. When the order had been given to make use of the Indians, but forbidding them to be cruel, Burke made a speech in the House of Commons, saying, "Suppose there was a riot on Tower Hill, what would the keeper of His Majesty's lions do? Would he not fling open the dens of the wild beasts, and then address them thus: 'My gentle lions, my humane bears, my tender-hearted hyenas, go forth. But I exhort you, as you are Christians and members of civilized society, to take care not to hurt any man, woman, or child.'" To punish the Indians for the massacres at Wyoming Valley and Cherry Valley, General Sullivan now marched into the Indian Territory, where he burned more than 40 villages. He also killed so many warriors that the Indians in that part of the country never again dared rise up against the Americans. The Indian War not only raged in the Northeast, but extended even into what is now Kentucky. Although there were but very few settlers there then, many of these were slain. To put an end to Indian raids, General George Rogers Clark of Virginia marched northward, hoping to conquer all the land between the Ohio, the Lakes, and the Mississippi. Although his army was small, it was composed of brave men, used to the woods and to the Indian way of fighting. They followed him boldly through the wilderness, fording rivers and streams. We are told that they once came to water so deep that their little drummer boy, seeing it would rise above his head, used his drum as a raft, begging the tallest soldier to steer him safely across. Marching thus from point to point, Clark's forces took all the forts in the Illinois country, but as he had few men, he could not send fair-sized garrisons to all. Some time after, Vincennes submitted. A large British force appeared to capture it, and loudly commanded the American officer there to surrender. After some parley, this man consented to do so, provided he and his garrison were allowed to march out with all the honors of war. The British officer granted this request, but imagine his surprise and anger when he saw the officer march out followed by only one man. These two composed the whole garrison, and could boast that they had held the fort of Vincennes against a force of 800 men. When Clark heard what had happened, he marched over with a large force and recaptured the fort. End of chapter 74.
Chapter 75 of the Story of the 13 Colonies. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Maggie Travers. The Story of the 13 Colonies by H. GUERBER. Chapter 75. Boone in Kentucky. As you have heard, the land south of the Ohio suffered much from Indian raids. This part of the country had already been the scene of so many Indian battles that it well deserved the name of Kentucky, or the Dark and Bloody Ground. 6 years before the Revolutionary War began, Daniel Boone, a hardy pioneer, first crossed the Allegheny Mountains and came into this beautiful region. Seeing the tall forest trees and plentiful game, he thought it would be a good place to live in. After wandering about it for months and escaping from the hands of some Indians who had taken him captive, Boone made up his mind to settle there. He therefore went back to North Carolina for his wife and daughter, and, with his brother and several other pioneers, returned to Kentucky where he formed a settlement called Boonesboro in 1775. Like all pioneer villages, this was merely a collection of a few log huts, surrounded by a tall palisade to serve as a rampart against Indian attacks. Boone's daughter and 2 younger girls, little suspecting danger, once went out in a canoe to pick flowers along the banks of a stream. Suddenly, several Indians sprang out of a thicket, seized them, and bore them off into the woods. While the younger girls cried helplessly, Boone's daughter, seeing it was of no use to struggle, quietly followed her captor. But she took care to leave the print of her shoe here and there where the soil was damp, to break twigs of bushes, and to fasten shreds of her dress to the briars along the way, so that her tracks could be followed. As soon as the girl's capture was discovered, Boone and 6 other men set out in pursuit. Thanks to the girl's clever way of marking her passage, they soon came to where the savages were camping in the woods. Creeping up stealthily, the white men noiselessly got between the children and the Indians, for they knew the latter would kill and scalp their captives at the first alarm. The Indians, suddenly finding themselves in danger, hastily fled, leaving captives and weapons behind them. In the 3rd year of the Revolutionary War, some Indians, hired by the British to make war along the frontier, came to attack Boonesboro, but the place was so gallantly defended by the settlers that they could not get in. They vainly directed a steady fire against the palisades for some time, and then withdrew to a short distance to rest. The settlers, who had very little powder within the palisade, were anxious to secure a keg full of powder that was standing in a hut nearby. Still, they knew that if a man ventured out, the Indians would probably kill him, and they did not feel that they could spare a single one. A brave girl, Elizabeth Zane, therefore insisted upon going, for she said that they could easily get along without her, although they needed all the men. At her request the gate was opened, and she sped like an arrow to the house where the powder had been left. The Indians, astonished at the sight of a woman running out of the fort, stood perfectly still. In a few seconds they saw her rush back, her apron full of powder. Now they understood what it all meant, but it was too late to stop the brave girl, who had reached the fort in safety. The powder thus secured saved the settlement, for the Indians, after losing many men, gave up the siege and went home. In 1778, while out hunting, Boone was captured by Indians who carried him off to Detroit. They were about to kill him when an old squaw claimed him to take the place of her son who had been slain. The Indians consented, and Boone was adopted by the squaw, who pulled out all his hair except a scalp lock, which she dressed with feathers in fine Indian style. Boone now made believe to be quite satisfied to stay with the Indians, so they took him out hunting every day, giving him only a certain amount of powder and bullets. Boone was such a good marksman that he soon found he could kill his game with half a bullet and less powder. He therefore secretly cut his bullets in two, and although he brought back a bird, rabbit, or deer for every charge the savages gave him, he really saved half his ammunition without their suspecting it. When he had thus collected enough powder and bullets, Boone stole a piece of dried meat and some parched corn, and went out hunting as usual. But as soon as he got out of sight, he began running as hard as he could. As he ran, he hid his traces, so the Indians could not follow him. Thus he darted along fallen trees, jumped from stone to stone, ran up and down shallow streams, and once, at least, grasped a trailing grapevine, and, swinging hard, landed on his feet a long distance ahead. The Indians, finding out his escape, soon started to follow him, but while they were hunting around for his broken tracks, he ran on, pausing to rest only when his strength gave out. Boone thus reached the Ohio, where he had the good luck to find a leaky canoe, in which he paddled across the stream. Then, for the first time, he used one of the bullets he had saved to kill a turkey, which he roasted over the first fire he had dared to light since his escape. Tramping thus all the way from the Indian camp to Boonesboro, Boone found his home deserted. At first he thought all his family had been killed, but he soon heard that they had merely gone back to their old home, thinking he was dead. As he knew the Indians would soon come to attack Boonesboro, Boone collected about 55 men, who helped him repair the palisade. They were scarcely through their work when more than 400 Indians appeared, led by a French officer serving in the British army. When they bade Boone surrender, he answered, "We are determined to defend our fort while a man of us lives." Although the Indians tried to break into the fort, they were driven back, and their bullets had no effect on the heavy logs of the palisade. Next, they made an attempt to set fire to the fort, but the flames were quickly quenched, and when they began to tunnel away into the place, they were forced to give it up. Weary of vain attempts, the Indians finally withdrew, and when they had gone, Boone and his companions picked up 125 pounds of bullets, which had fallen harmlessly along the palisade. Later on, Boone brought his family back to Kentucky, but the Indians continued to make trouble during the next 10 years. Still, when those dark days were all over, so many settlers came into Kentucky that Boone declared the place was too crowded for him, and said he needed more elbow room. He therefore removed first to a place near the Great Kanawha, and then to Missouri, which at that time belonged to Spain. Here he lived long enough to see many settlers cross the Mississippi. He was again saying that he felt crowded, and talking of moving still farther west, when he died, at the age of 85, still hale and hearty, and a famous hunter and pioneer. End of chapter 75. Recording by Maggie Travers.
Chapter 76 of the Story of the 13 Colonies. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Bruce Kachuk. The Story of the 13 Colonies by H.A. GUERBER. Famous Sea Fights. While American patriots were busy fighting the British on land, others, equally brave, were fighting them at sea. As soon as the war began, Congress gave seamen letters of marque, which were permissions to attack and seize any British vessel they met. The bravest and best known of all the American seamen of this time was John Paul Jones. Although born in Scotland, he adopted this country for his own, and, when the War of Independence began, offered his services to Congress. He proved such an able seaman that in 1777 he was sent to France on an important errand. Although the French did not give him a large ship, as he had hoped, he boldly cruised around in a little American vessel called the Ranger, on which he hoisted the first American flag ever seen and saluted at sea. Paul Jones sailed boldly along, capturing and sinking English vessels, and even running into the port of Whitehaven, where he tried to burn all the shipping. Then, as his boat was no longer good enough to continue fighting, he went back to France in quest of a long-promised new ship. But after 5 months' weary delay, he was still ashore and waiting. One day he read in Poor Richard's Almanac, "If you would have your business done, go. If not, send." This saying seemed so true that he immediately set out for Paris. There he managed to talk to the French minister, who again promised him a fine ship. But when the young seaman saw this craft 5 days later, he was sorely disappointed, for it was both old and clumsy. Still, any kind of a ship was better than no ship at all, so Paul Jones named it Bonhomme Richard, a French translation of Poor Richard. Then he set sail in it, accompanied by a few smaller vessels, and coasted along the North Sea. There Jones ran near the shore, where his visits were so dreaded that, we are told, an old Scotch minister at Kirkcaldy once prayed, "Now, dear Lord, don't you think it a shame for you to send this vile pirate to rob our folk of Kirkcaldy? You know that they are poor enough already, and have nothing to spare." Still, Paul Jones was not so vile a pirate as the old minister supposed, for whenever he landed for provisions, he paid the poor people for the food and cattle he took. We are also told that, his men having once robbed a castle of its silver plate, Jones sent it all back 8 years later with a polite note. But while Jones did not wish to harm the poor, he did want to damage the British Navy as much as he could. He therefore cruised about until he met the Serapis, a British man-of-war, off Flamborough Head, 1779. Here was waged one of the fiercest naval battles ever fought. Although Jones's ship was afire from the very beginning, his guns all disabled, the vessel shot away between decks and slowly sinking, he boldly lashed it fast to the Serapis. While doing so, he heard one of his men swear, and turning to him, quietly said, "Don't swear, sir. In another moment we may all be in eternity." By this time the smoke was so thick that the British captain could not see whether the American flag had been hauled down. He therefore shouted, "Have you struck your colors?" But Jones coolly answered, "I have not yet begun to fight." Such was Jones's pluck that the British commander finally yielded. But when he gave up his sword to Paul Jones, he haughtily said, "It is with great reluctance that I surrender my sword to a man who fights with a halter round his neck." Paul Jones gave him back the weapon, politely saying, "Captain Pearson, you have fought like a hero, and I have no doubt that your sovereign will reward you for it in the most ample manner." These words came true, for after Captain Pearson had been duly exchanged, George III called him to court and made him a knight. As the Bonhomme Richard was sinking, Jones transferred his men and prisoners to the Serapis. Then he sadly watched his own ship settle down and vanish beneath the waves. The Serapis was next taken to France, where it was discovered that Captain Landais, the French commander of one of the smaller vessels in Jones's fleet, was insane. Paul Jones and his men had known this for some time, because Landais had disobeyed orders several times, and when the Bonhomme Richard was fighting against the Serapis, had even used his cannon against it instead of attacking the enemy. The news of Paul Jones' victory caused great rejoicings both in America and in France, and when the young captain returned to the latter country, he was invited to court with Franklin. King Louis XVI heard Jones's account of the fight and told him that his enemy, Captain Pearson, had just been knighted and had received a new ship. Paul Jones then gaily answered, "Well, he deserved the honor, and if I meet him in his new ship, I'll make a lord of him." This answer greatly amused the king, but at the same time it showed that Paul Jones, hero as he was, had one great fault, that of boasting. When he came back to America, Congress honored him, but as the young sailor did not think his services were well enough appreciated in America, he left our country soon after the war was ended and went to serve Russia. Paul Jones was not the only hero on the seas at this time, for, we are told, the American privateers captured 500 British vessels in 3 years, secured much booty, and did great harm to the shipping in several English ports. End of chapter 76. Chapter 77 of the Story of the 13 Colonies. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Bruce Kachuk. The Story of the 13 Colonies by H.A. Gerber. The Swamp Fox. The British had failed, not only in their first attempt against Boston, but also in their second, to seize the Hudson Valley and thus separate the southern colonies from New England. But, as they were not yet ready to give up the struggle, they decided to try a third plan. That was to begin a new campaign in the far south and march up the Atlantic coast, leaving nothing but conquered people behind them. In 1778, therefore, they began their operations by besieging and taking Savannah. Soon after, they became masters of Augusta and of nearly all Georgia. These successes delighted them, for, with one province won, they fancied they would soon be masters of all the rest. Still, before they could do much more, the French fleet under D'Estaing and an American army under Lincoln came to recover Savannah. While the French were bombarding that city from their ships, the Americans, led by Pulaski, tried to storm it. 1779. But in spite of a most gallant charge, the patriots were driven back with great loss. Among the dead was Sergeant Jasper, still holding the flag given him at Fort Moultrie, and Count Pulaski, the generous Pole who had joined the army and served under Washington in the Battle of the Brandywine. Both of these men were so brave that their names will never be forgotten, and in Savannah fine monuments have been erected in their honor. The first attempt to take Savannah having failed, the French admiral refused to lend any more aid to the Americans in the South. So Lincoln, after defending Charleston alone for 40 days, was forced to surrender. The British, coming to the city, exacted such hard conditions from him that they roused the indignation of all true Americans. But when the British minister heard that the city was taken, he proudly cried, "We look on America as at our feet." The British now overran the state, behaving most cruelly everywhere. An officer named Tarleton not only burned houses and beat women and children, but when some Americans asked for quarter, that is, vowed not to fight any more if he would spare their lives, he broke his promise and had them all killed. Because he did not keep his word, the expression Tarleton's quarter was used in the South as a term for immediate death. Although by Lincoln's surrender one American army was lost, the patriots were not ready to give up yet, and as soon as another force was raised, Gates was sent southward to command it. He was so proud of his victory at Saratoga that he started out full of confidence. When he stopped on his way to visit Lee, the latter, hearing him boast, quietly remarked, "Take care your northern laurels do not turn to southern willows." Unfortunately, however, Gates paid no heed to this warning. Thinking he would soon force Cornwallis to surrender, he was very imprudent, and when he met the British at Camden a few months later, 1780, he suffered a defeat instead of winning a victory. We are told that when he saw the day was lost, Gates turned and fled, never daring to stop until he had put about 80 miles between himself and his foes. The German officer De Kalb, who had so generously come to help the Americans, fought in this battle with great courage and died from the 11 wounds he received there. He is buried at Camden, where a monument marks his resting place. This was the worst battle for the Americans during the whole war, and it was speedily followed by the loss of nearly all South Carolina. The only people who still had courage to fight were a few patriots led by such heroes as Marion, Sumter, and Pickens. The first of these 3 men was so upright, brave, and gentlemanly that he has often been compared to a brave French knight, and is therefore known as the Bayard of the South. Marion and his men had retreats in the woods and swamps, whence they made sudden raids upon the British. It seems that the latter, wishing to exchange prisoners, once sent an officer into one of these hiding places under a flag of truce. As Marion did not wish the British to learn the way to his retreat, the officer was blindfolded and led a long distance. When his bandage was removed, he was surprised to find himself not in a fort or house, as he had expected, but in a lonely spot in the woods. Marion stepped forward, politely offered him a seat on a log, and when business was over, cordially invited him to share his dinner. The officer was just wondering where his dining room could be when one of the ragged soldiers appeared, carrying a piece of bark on which smoked some sweet potatoes, roasted in the campfire. Marion helped his guest to a potato on a chip, and began to eat one himself with a relish. Of course, the British officer immediately followed his example, but he soon asked whether the American officers often dined so simply. Marion, the swamp fox, answered, "Yes," and then gaily added, "But we are fortunate on this occasion, having company to entertain, to have more than our usual allowance." The officer, hearing this, suggested that the Americans probably gave their soldiers big pay to make up for such poor fare and uncomfortable quarters. But Marion truthfully answered that he received no salary at all. The astonished officer then asked why he served such a mean country at all, and the brave young Southerner, looking him full in the face, proudly remarked that a man was always ready to do anything for the lady he loved, and that the name of his sweetheart was Liberty. The British officer could not but admire such a man and such an answer. On returning to camp, we are told, he left the service, saying he would have no share in depriving such brave men as Marion of the rights due them. End of chapter 77. Chapter 78 of the Story of the 13 Colonies. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Bruce Kachuk. The Story of the 13 Colonies by H.A. GUERBER. The Poor Soldiers. In the meantime, things were going very badly in the north. The winter spent at Valley Forge had, indeed, been hard to bear, but that which Washington spent at Morristown was in some respects even worse. Congress in those days had no power to tax the people to raise money. The states were in many cases too poor to supply much, and it was very difficult to borrow funds abroad, because it was quite evident that if the Americans were beaten, their debts would never be paid. Already in 1777, Congress began to issue paper money. Of course it had no real value of its own, like gold or silver, but was merely a promise that Congress would some day give the bearer the amount it called for in real money. As everybody knew that Congress did not have, and therefore could not give, gold or silver in exchange for these continental bills, no one liked to take them in payment for food or clothing. To make matters worse, the British printed ever so many bills, just like those issued by Congress, and paper money soon became so nearly worthless as to give rise to the expression still used, "not worth a continental." By this time there was 200 millions worth of this money in circulation, and people gave $150 in bills for a bushel of corn, and several thousand for a suit of clothes, when they had no silver or gold. Many times during the Revolutionary War, the soldiers, knowing their families were starving, clamored loudly for their money. As it was not paid to them, some of them rebelled, and it took all their love for Washington, the only person whom they really trusted, to hold the army together. Still, these soldiers were faithful to their country, for when British spies once came among them, offering gold if they would only desert, they nobly gave these spies up to their officers, saying that, while they wanted their dues, they were not traitors. The British not only tried to win over the men, but also attempted to bribe American officers and statesmen, but they failed in this too, and when they approached Joseph Reed, he proudly said, "I am not worth purchasing, but, such as I am, the King of Great Britain is not rich enough to buy me." Washington always supplied the needs of his men as far as he could, but, as he had been away from Mount Vernon several years now, his fortune was much smaller than it had been, and as time went on he had less and less ready money. In despair at his men's sufferings, he wrote again and again to Congress. Finally, he warned Robert Morris, who had charge of money matters, that it would be impossible to keep the army together if food, money, and clothing were not forthcoming right away. This appeal proved successful. Morris not only gave all the money he had, but, going from door to door, begged from all his friends for the safety of the country. The Philadelphians nobly answered his appeal, and on New Year's Day, Washington could gladden the soldiers' hearts by giving them food and money. Shortly after, the Philadelphia ladies, wishing to help also, sent him 22,000 shirts, which they had made for the almost naked soldiers, who were glad to get into warm and whole garments. End of chapter 78. Chapter 79 of the Story of the 13 Colonies. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Bruce Kachuk. The Story of the 13 Colonies by H.A. GUERBER. The Spy. You may remember that Benedict Arnold marched gallantly through the Maine woods to attack Quebec and was wounded there in the beginning of the war. After his recovery, he showed his courage in many ways. For instance, he was once surrounded by Tories, who killed his horse. While Arnold was trying to release his foot from the stirrup, one of his foes rushed toward him, crying, "Surrender!" "Not yet," answered Arnold, and drawing his pistol, he shot the Tory, jumped up, and ran into the woods nearby. There, finding another horse, he quickly mounted and came back to take part in the fight once more. You remember, too, how he won the victory of Stillwater, with Morgan and Schuyler, while Gates was lingering idly in his tent. On this occasion, however, Arnold was again badly wounded. As he lay upon the ground, helpless, one of the enemy, who had fought with great valor and had fallen only a moment before him, slowly raised himself, and, in spite of a bad wound, tried to get at Arnold to kill him. Just then a friend of Arnold's came up and was about to slay the soldier, when Arnold stopped him by crying, "For God's sake, don't hurt him. He is a fine fellow." Although Arnold could thus show himself both brave and forgiving, he had one great fault: his vanity. While recovering from his wound in Philadelphia, he got into bad company, ran into debt, and behaved in such a way that Congress bade Washington reprove him publicly for his conduct. Washington did so as gently as he could, and some time later, when Arnold asked him for the command at West Point, he gladly granted this request, for he knew that Arnold was brave, and thought he had been treated rather unfairly. But no sooner had Arnold secured this important place than, forgetting his duty to his country and his honor as a man, he determined to avenge his wrongs by giving up the fort to the British. 1780. He therefore began a secret correspondence with General Clinton, and finally arranged to meet a British officer, so as to settle the particulars of the affair with him. True to the appointment, Major John André came up the Hudson in an English vessel, the Vulture. Landing at night, he met Arnold as agreed, but their talk lasted until morning, and the ship, being then discovered by the Americans, was fired upon. It therefore dropped down the river. Seeing that he could not join it without running too great a risk of discovery, André now got a pass from Arnold. He then crossed the Hudson and set out for New York on horseback, reaching Tarrytown in safety, although travelers were then often stopped by parties of skinners or cowboys, as marauding British and American troops were generally called. André was just beginning to think that all danger of capture was over, when 3 men suddenly sprang out of the bushes, seized his horse, and forced him to dismount. Although André offered his horse, his watch, and a large sum of money to these 3 men if they would only let him go, they held him fast and began searching him. At first they found nothing suspicious, but in his boots they finally discovered plans of the fort at West Point and other important papers. Sure that they held a spy, Paulding, Williams, and Van Wart now sent word to Arnold to look out, for they had caught a spy, and then they took André to White Plains. Arnold was at breakfast when the notice of André's capture reached him. Rising from the table, he hurriedly explained matters to his fainting wife, kissed his child good-bye, and, mounting his horse, galloped wildly off to the river. There he found his boat as usual, and was rowed off to the Vulture. The British, who had watched his approach, received him in grim silence, for while they would have been glad to take advantage of his baseness, they all despised him as a traitor. Washington, then on his way to West Point, received the news of André's arrest too late to seize Arnold, although he tried very hard to do so. Still, he did not forget that Arnold's wife was innocent. Pitying her evident suffering, he soon sent her word that her husband had escaped, and said that she would be allowed to join him in New York. The news of Arnold's treachery, which wrung tears from Washington, and made him exclaim, "Whom can we trust now?" filled the whole country with dismay. People were horror-struck. But while all hated Arnold, many were almost as excited over the capture and probable fate of André. An artist, writer, and soldier, this young man had many admirers, but as he had played the part of a spy, and had been captured in disguise within the American lines, most people thought he deserved to be hanged. Still, it was felt that Arnold, the traitor, was the one who merited that death most. So, when the British protested that André should not be hanged, the Americans offered to exchange him for Arnold, thinking that, if they could only make an example of the real culprit, it would prevent similar cases in the future. But, much as the British despised Arnold, they could not, of course, give him up. André's trial, therefore, went on, and the jury condemned him to death as a spy. Instead of treating him as the British had treated Hale, however, the Americans allowed him to write to his friends and prepare for death. When he was ready, André paid the penalty of his wrongdoing by being hanged. Still, people have always felt sorry for him, and the British, who would have gained greatly by his spying, declared that he had fallen a martyr. They therefore gave him a place in Westminster Abbey, where many of their greatest men are buried. Besides, 2 monuments have been erected for him in our country, at Tarrytown and Tappan, thus marking the places where he was captured and hanged. But, although André was hanged, his sufferings were slight and merciful compared with those of Arnold. This was just, for, while the former had tried to serve his country, the latter had betrayed his trust, and it was natural that his conscience should trouble him night and day. Although the British, as they had promised, gave him a large sum of money and a place in their army, none of their officers ever treated him as a friend. We are told that Washington, still anxious to secure and punish Arnold for the country's sake, made a plan to seize him shortly after his escape. An officer named Camp deserted the American army by Washington's orders and, narrowly escaping recapture by his comrades, who were not in the secret, swam out to a British vessel anchored in New York Bay. The enemy, having breathlessly watched his escape from his pursuers, welcomed him warmly, and, without asking any questions, allowed him to enlist in Arnold's new regiment. Camp intended, with the help of 2 other patriots, to seize and gag Arnold when he was walking alone in his garden, as he did every night. Thence they meant to convey him to a boat, row him secretly across the river, and hand him over to one of Washington's most devoted officers, Henry Lee, who was called Light Horse Harry, to distinguish him from the Lee who disgraced himself at Monmouth. Unfortunately, on the very night when Camp's plan was to have been carried out, Arnold took his regiment on board a vessel in the bay and sailed south to fight for the British in Virginia. There, poor Camp had to wait for months before he got a chance to desert Arnold and rejoin his countrymen. Until then, all his fellow soldiers had believed him a real deserter, but after welcoming him cordially, Washington and Lee publicly told the others how nobly Camp had tried to serve his country and how nearly he had secured the traitor. While fighting in the South, we are told, Arnold once asked one of his prisoners, "What do you suppose my fate would be if my misguided countrymen were to take me prisoner?" The man, who was a good American, promptly answered, "They would cut off the leg that was wounded at Quebec and Saratoga and bury it with the honors of war. But the rest of you they would hang on a gibbet." End of chapter 79. Chapter 80 of the Story of the 13 Colonies. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Bruce Kachuk. The Story of the 13 Colonies by H.A. GUERBER. A Traitor's Death. Before continuing the story of the Revolutionary War, it is well to finish this painful story of a traitor. After fighting against his country in Virginia and burning many houses and villages there, Arnold was sent into Connecticut, where he set fire to New London, watching the flames from the church tower. But soon after this, Arnold went to London, where he spent most of the rest of his life, with few friends. We are told that no one respected him there, and once, when he went into Parliament to hear the speeches, a member pointed right at him, saying, "Mr. Speaker, I will not speak while that man is in the House." Another time, Arnold was introduced to a British officer who had fought against him at Saratoga. But while this man had then admired him for his courage, and would have been proud to know him, he now refused to shake hands with him, curtly saying that he could not endure traitors. A gentleman who did not know Arnold's story once asked him for letters of introduction to his friends, saying he was about to sail for America. But the traitor sadly answered, "I was born in America, I lived there to the prime of my life, but alas, I can call no man in America my friend." In fact, even his children were so ashamed of what he had done that 2 of his sons changed their name as soon as they grew up. After living thus 20 years, bereft of his own as well as public respect, Arnold, on his deathbed, begged for the epaulettes and sword knot which Washington had once given him, and cried, "Let me die in my old American uniform in which I fought my battles. God forgive me for ever having put on any other." Arnold was buried in England. While his victories are honored in America, his treachery has made his name so disliked that it is always coupled with the words "the traitor." The battles of Saratoga, where he, Schuyler, and Morgan really won the victories attributed to Gates, are kept in mind by history and by the beautiful monument at Saratoga. There you can see 4 niches. 3 are occupied by statues of Gates, Schuyler, and Morgan, but the 4th, which was to contain a statue of Arnold, must always remain empty. The sadness which filled all patriot hearts in the country at the news of Arnold's treason was, however, soon made more bearable by the welcome tidings of a victory in the South, the Battle of King's Mountain, 1780. More than 1,000 of the British troops took up their position on the top of this mountain, and their leader then cried, "Well, boys, here is a place from which all the rebels outside of hell cannot drive us." Still, a smaller number of patriots climbed up by 3 different paths, and, hiding behind rocks and trees, killed many of the British and took the rest prisoners. General Greene, taking command of the American forces in the South after Gates's defeat at Camden, found himself at the head of a ragged and almost famished army. But stout hearts beat beneath tattered garments, and the forces under Morgan soon after won a great victory at Cowpens, 1781. The cruel Tarleton was in command on this occasion, and during the battle he was wounded by Colonel William Washington, a distant relative of the general-in-chief. In speaking of the battle afterwards, Tarleton scornfully remarked to an American lady that Colonel Washington was so ignorant a man that he could not even write his own name. As people who could not write in those days were in the habit of making a rough mark instead of signing their names, the lady archly said, pointing to his wound, "Colonel, you bear evidence that he can, at least, make his mark." When Tarleton later added that he wondered what Colonel Washington looked like, the same lady slyly said, "Had you only looked behind you at Cowpens, you might have had that pleasure." End of chapter 80.
Chapter 81 of the Story of the 13 Colonies. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Christine G. The Story of the 13 Colonies by H.A. GUERBER. 2 Unselfish Women. When the Battle of Cowpens was over, and the few remnants of Tarleton's force had fled to join Cornwallis, the latter marched forward, hoping to catch up with Morgan's army and crush it with his superior force before it could join Greene's forces. Both armies were therefore anxious to reach the ford over the Catawba first, and tramped ahead as fast as possible, stopping to rest only when the men were completely exhausted. But, in spite of the great odds against him, Morgan finally managed to give Cornwallis the slip, and, crossing at the ford, was soon joined by Greene. The two generals continued the retreat, cleverly tempting Cornwallis to follow, until finally the whole American army was safe beyond the Dan River in Virginia. We are told that it was during this race for the Dan that Greene once stopped at the house of a patriot Southern lady, Mrs. Steele. She quickly supplied him with warm garments and food, and hearing him say he could not pay her because he was penniless, she brought him all her savings, which she forced him to accept and use for the sake of his country. It seems also that in the course of this campaign the Americans laid siege to a house which served as a fort for British soldiers. Although Light Horse Harry Lee was very anxious to secure these men, he soon found that he could not drive them out of the house. He therefore asked Mrs. Mott, owner of the place, whether she would allow him to set fire to it, to force the British out. She not only consented to this, although the house was all she had, but brought Lee an Indian bow and arrows so that he could shoot bits of flaming wood upon the shingled roof. The house was thus soon in flames, and the British, seeing they would be roasted alive if they stayed in it, and shot if they tried to escape, promptly surrendered. Then the fire was put out, and as it had not yet gained much headway, Mrs. Mott did not, after all, lose the house which she had been willing to sacrifice for the sake of her country. As was the case all through the Southern campaign, the British were very cruel. Still, a few patriots managed to escape from their clutches. For example, one of the Tarleton's men once ordered a prisoner to give him the silver buckles he wore. The man proudly bade the Englishman take them if he wanted them. Knowing that he would be slain if he did not escape, the American killed the man kneeling before him, and, jumping on a riderless horse, dashed away. Before any of the 400 men around there thought of pursuing him, he was out of reach. As soon as his men had rested a little from their fatigues, Greene again led them against the British, whom he met at Guilford Courthouse in North Carolina. Here, although the Americans behaved with great valor, the British won the victory. But it was at the cost of so many lives that when Fox, a British statesman, heard of it, he sadly exclaimed, "Another such victory would ruin us." The site of the old Revolutionary battlefield at Guilford is now a beautiful park. Here are many interesting statues, and in the museum, among other curiosities, you can see British and American flags peacefully crossed, showing that after the war was over the two parties generously forgot the past and were ready to meet as friends. After the battle of Guilford Courthouse, Cornwallis retreated to the coast, and Greene turned his attention to the British forces farther south, with which he fought the battles of Hobkirk Hill and Utah Springs. In the latter engagement, Marion, surrounded by the foe, encouraged his brave men by saying, "Hold up your heads, boys! 3 fires, 3 cheers, and a charge, and you are free!" During the same engagement one of Lee's men found himself alone and without arms in the midst of the enemy. With a great presence of mind, he seized an officer, wrenched his sword out of his hand, and, using him as a shield, fought his way back to his friends. Though Greene was often defeated, and never won a great victory, the British loudly complained that he never knew when he was beaten. But while Greene modestly described his own doings as "We fight, get beat, rise and fight again," he and his 2,000 men were little by little driving the British out of South Carolina. Indeed, by their brave efforts the Americans finally recovered both South Carolina and Georgia, with the exception of the cities of Charleston and Savannah. End of Two Unselfish Women.
Chapter 82 of The Story of the 13 Colonies. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Giordano. The Story of the 13 Colonies by H. A. GUERBER. The Surrender of Cornwallis. Retreating from the Carolinas, Cornwallis marched into Virginia to take the place of Arnold, whom the British had been watching closely, lest he should betray them too. Clinton now bade Cornwallis keep near the coast, so that he could embark quickly and come to the rescue of New York, in case Washington should suddenly attack it. The fact was, though, that Washington had no intention of doing anything of the sort. On the contrary, he had laid his plans to catch Cornwallis in Virginia, where he had sent Lafayette some time before. As he did not wish Clinton to suspect this plan, Washington wrote letters saying he meant to take New York, and cleverly contrived they should accidentally fall into British hands. After reading them, Clinton felt so sure he knew all about the American plans that he did not stir. There was no telegraph in those days, and it was a great surprise to Cornwallis when the French fleet, under de Grasse, suddenly appeared in Chesapeake Bay. Thus, even before Clinton suspected the Americans' intentions, Cornwallis was hemmed in at Yorktown between Lafayette's troops and de Grasse's fleet, and Washington was rapidly marching southward to help them. Hoping to check Washington's advance, or even force him to come back, Clinton now sent Arnold into Connecticut, where, as we have seen, he burned New London. This base deed so angered a lady whose guest he had once been, that she tried to shoot him, we are told, and would have done so had not her gun missed fire. Arnold, and the British officers with him, proved very cruel all through this campaign, and when one of them seized Fort Griswold, near New London, he haughtily demanded, "Who commands here?" "I did," courteously answered the American officer, coming forward to surrender his sword. "But you do now." The British officer took the weapon, ran it through its owner, and coolly bade his men kill all the garrison in the same way. Although the news of pillage, burning, and murder was carried to Washington as quickly as possible, he did not, as Clinton perhaps expected, turn around to defend Connecticut, but kept steadily on. As he marched by, all good Americans wildly cheered him, crying, "Long live Washington! He is going to catch Cornwallis in his mousetrap." Indeed, such was the faith people had in him, that an old patriot, coming into the room where he was dining, raised his arms to heaven and solemnly cried, like Simeon in the Bible, "Lord, now lettest thou thy servant depart in peace, for mine eyes have seen thy salvation." On his way to Yorktown, Washington paid a flying visit to his home at Mount Vernon, which he had not seen since he had left it to attend the Continental Congress 6 years before. There he learned that he would have been burned to the ground had not his steward bribed some British soldiers to let it stand. When Washington heard this, he gravely said he would rather lose all he had than save it by making friends with his country's foes. Reaching Yorktown, where Cornwallis had once boasted that he would soon capture "that boy," as he scornfully termed Lafayette, Washington found all his orders so well carried out that the bombarding of the city could begin without further delay. The French fleet and American army worked together to such good purpose that before long it became plain that Cornwallis would have to yield. During this siege a gentleman carefully pointed out his own house, advising Washington to batter it down first with his cannon, for he thought that Cornwallis must have selected it for his headquarters, because it was the best in town. Washington, who was never wounded in any battle, stood on a height directing the movements of his troops. He was in such an exposed place that some of his aides, hoping to make him change his position, ventured to remark that they were in great danger. "If you think so," answered Washington quietly, "you are at liberty to step back." But as he did not move, the others bravely stood their ground. A moment later a ball struck a cannon only a few feet off, and General Knox impulsively cried, "My dear General, we can't spare you yet," and tried to drag him away. But Washington carelessly remarked, "It's a spent ball," and stood there like a rock until he saw the redoubt taken. Then he joyfully exclaimed, "The work is done, and well done." Washington was right. The work was done, and the patriots' troubles nearly over. Cornwallis, finding himself unable to escape or receive help, was forced to surrender on the 19th of October, 1781. But his pride was so hurt at having to give up his sword that he pretended illness, and sent one of his officers to carry it to Washington. The latter, remembering how the British had tried to shame General Lincoln at the surrender of Charleston, therefore bade the British officer deliver it to Lincoln. The next day, when the British troops marched out of Yorktown between the French and American armies, their bands dolefully played "The World Turned Upside Down." Washington, ever considerate of people's feelings, had given strict orders that his soldiers should not jeer at the enemy, or make any unkind remarks. This order was obeyed, but Lafayette, seeing that the British, who had made such unmerciful fun of him, did not even look up, suddenly bade his band strike up "Yankee Doodle." At this hated sound the British all started, and Lafayette had the boyish satisfaction of knowing that they had seen him heading part of the forces which had conquered them. End of Chapter 82. Recording by Giordano. Newport Richey, Florida. Chapter 83 of The Story of the 13 Colonies. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Giordano. The Story of the 13 Colonies by H.A. GUERBER. The British Flag Hauled Down. The news of the surrender of Cornwallis filled all American hearts with joy, for our people knew, as well as the British, that the war was now ended. The tidings reached Philadelphia at night, while the watchman, making his rounds as usual, was passing up and down the streets. To the customary announcement of the time and the cry, "All's well," he therefore added, "and Cornwallis is taken." The joy of this event proved fatal to the old doorkeeper of Congress, while on all sides bells were rung and loud cheers were heard. On the next day the members of Congress marched in a body to church, to return thanks for the victory of a great and good man in a great and good cause. But when the news reached England, it caused great dismay. We are told that Lord North fell back as if struck by a cannon ball, and gasped, "Oh God, it is all over!" Although the War of Independence was really over, and several Americans went to Europe to settle the terms of peace, British troops stayed in America some time longer, and kept possession of Savannah and Charleston about a year. Washington, therefore, did not dare dismiss his army. To keep better guard over the British at New York, he collected all his forces at Newburgh. But although there were no more fighting, Washington's presence was more sorely needed than ever, for the men, having received only a small part of their long-promised pay, and unable to go home and work for their destitute families, were restless and discontented. In fact, even the officers thought Congress managed things badly, and wished to make Washington king. Had Washington thought of himself more than of others, or been unduly ambitious, he could now have gone, at the head of the army, to overthrow Congress and take the power into his own hands, like Caesar and Napoleon. But Washington was a real patriot, and had no thought beyond the good of his country. He therefore sent for his officers, and made them a little speech. In reading a letter from a congressman, promising that they should receive their dues, he had to take out his glasses, and as he put them on, he quietly begged them to excuse him, saying, "My eyes have grown dim in the service of my country, but I have never doubted her justice." In his address, he urged them not to tarnish the glory of their past services by rash conduct, and explained that Congress would soon settle their just demands. Such was the reliance placed upon his mere word, and the good influence he had over every man in his army, that all now consented to wait patiently until their services could receive their reward. While Washington was thus keeping the soldiers in order, Franklin was in Europe, treating for peace. In 1782, George III. formally announced that he would recognize the independence of the United States, and closed his speech by saying he hoped that the same religion, language, interests, and affections might prove a bond of permanent union between the two countries. The treaty, however, was signed in Paris on the 3rd of September, 1783. On this occasion Franklin donned the suit of Manchester velvet clothes which he had worn 10 years before, when insulted in Parliament, and which he had vowed never to use again until his country was free. By this treaty the sea-coast from Maine to Georgia was given up to the United States, together with all the land between the Great Lakes and Florida, westward as far as the Mississippi. At the same time, the British gave Florida back to Spain. The news of this treaty was followed by the departure of the British soldiers from New York. They sailed away, leaving their flag still floating from the top of the Liberty Pole. Here some soldiers had nailed it fast, carefully greasing the pole so that the Americans should not haul down their colors until they were at least out of sight. But a clever New York boy, seeing that it was useless to try to climb the greased pole in the usual way, ran into a neighboring store, and soon came back with a pocket full of nails, some cleats, and a hammer. Nailing a cleat a short distance up, he stood upon it to nail another still higher, and, climbing thus from point to point, reached the top of the pole, tore off the British flag, and replaced it by the American colors, amid the cheers of the assembled people. End of Chapter 83. Recording by Giordano. Newport Richey, Florida.
Chapter 84 of the Story of the 13 Colonies. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Larry Wilson. The Story of the 13 Colonies by H.A. Gerber. Washington's Farewell. Washington had already disbanded his army in Newburgh, when on the 8th anniversary of the Battle of Lexington, the war was formally declared to be over. Now, the British having gone, it remained only to bid farewell to his officers. On this occasion he said, "With a heart full of love and gratitude, I now take leave of you. I most devoutly wish that your latter days be as prosperous as your former have been glorious and honorable. I cannot come to each of you to take my leave, but I shall be obliged to you if each of you will come and take me by the hand." General Knox was the first to advance, and Washington drew him toward him and kissed him, and also embraced all the rest in dead silence, for all hearts were too full for speech. The officers then followed him to the boat and silently watched him out of sight. From New York, where this parting took place, Washington went direct to Annapolis, where on the 23rd of December, 1783, he received the formal message: "The United States in Congress assembled is prepared to receive the communications of the Commander in Chief." Washington then appeared before that body to lay down the heavy charge which he had borne so bravely for nearly 8 years. He again refused to accept any reward for his services, but handed over the exact account of his expenses, proving that he had spent more than $63,000 of his own money for the good of his country. Then he went back to his farm at Mount Vernon, to take up again his usual work. He had been longing to do this for some time, for farming was his chief pleasure. Knowing this, his officers formed a society of which they made him head. They called himself the Cincinnati, in honor of a Roman patriot, Cincinnatus, who left his plow to save his country from danger, but hurried back to it as soon as the war was over. Instead of other pay, many of these officers and of the Continental soldiers now received grants of land in what was then called the Northwest Territory. There they soon settled, working hard and serving their country just as nobly by being good farmers, good citizens, good husbands, and good fathers as they had done by being good soldiers in the Revolutionary War. Before long, towns sprang up in the wilderness, and one of them was named Cincinnati, in honor of the society of which Washington was the first president. But there were others besides the soldiers who were anxious to get back to their families. Foremost among these was the worthy Franklin, who had spent nearly 9 years in France looking after the interests of his country. He had seen the Peace of Paris signed, and when he reached Philadelphia, just 62 years after his first visit, he was welcomed with loud cheers and great rejoicings. He deserved all the cheering and honors he received, for he had been second only to Washington in the services he had rendered his beloved country. As it was now decided beyond doubt that the former colonies were to be free states, independent of Great Britain, the stories of the 13 colonies is ended. There is still to be told the story of the great republic which was formed from these colonies, and which has grown to be one of the foremost nations in the world. End of Chapter 84. End of the Story of the 13 Colonies by H.A. Gerber.